Welcome back, dear people. Now it's summertime, but we talk about spring. So welcome, Kai.
Mic on? Oh yeah, this is on. So thank you, Roger. Welcome everybody to my session about JSON API for Spring HATEOAS. Before I start, I would like to introduce myself. So my name is Kai. I work at Siemens Smart Infrastructure in the CTO office, in the Software Strategy and Architecture department. So I love open source for many decades. So I represented Siemens in the Eclipse Foundation, also was a committer on the Eclipse IDE. Some of you might have used it. If there's any open questions, you can reach me anytime, and I will be here at the event the full day today and also tomorrow. You find me at code at kai.tutor, and in GitHub it's just my last name. So I started very early on. There were not so many people named Tutor, and so I just took my last name as GitHub label. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you some questions to get to know you better. So how many of you are actually software developers? Oh, this is almost everyone. Okay, this is good. How many of you have developed a RESTful web service in any environment? Oh, this is 50%. Great. How many of you have experience with Java? Oh, this is a little bit less, but I would say 30%, which is great. From the Java guys, any experience with Spring? It's getting lesser and lesser. Okay, but now final question, and I wouldn't expect any raised hands, but I ask it. How many of you have implemented a RESTful web service using hypermedia? Oh, this is quite a lot. Okay, interesting. So, this is a very technical talk. So, the first question is, it's about JSON API. And why actually JSON API? So it started all a couple of years ago when the Siemens accelerator took off, and we decided that it would be a great idea to having internal API design guidelines for several tech stacks, for REST, for async, for GraphQL, probably for different things. And we started with REST. And before we started it, the group evaluated every existing framework and structure out there. Yeah. So structures using hypermedia, structures that didn't use hypermedia. From the hypermedia, we evaluated Siren, collection plus JSON, Hell Forms, Uber, and JSON API. And actually, we gathered requirements what our REST APIs should do most of the times, and many of those things that we wanted to do were included in JSON API out of the box. So we decided that when we start the API design guidelines, we base it on JSON API and then fill the gaps that are not specified with JSON API. So what is JSON API? When you go to the website, jasonapi.org, it says JSON API is designed to minimize both the number of requests and the amount of data transmitted between client and servers. And this is a big point because many of our APIs deal with huge amounts of data. And we have, of course, we reduce them using pagination. But for instance, if you write a REST API, give me all the 1,000 ranked movies in the Internet Movie Database with all the directors, and you use plain JSON. What do you think? How often you will find Christopher Nolan or George Lucas in it? Many, many, many times. And with JSON API, you will find George Lucas only once and Christopher Nolan also only once. Why? I explain you later. So another thing, HATEOAS. This is very hard to pronounce. It's for hypermedia as the engine of application state. So you can pronounce it a little bit like the word hideous, like HATEOAS. Please don't say HATEOAS. Because some people might then wrongly think that you might hate an application server of a huge company starting with the letter O. I don't name this one. So when you Google for it or take a look at Wikipedia. It says, with HATEOAS, a client interacts with the network application whose application servers provide information dynamically through hypermedia. Yeah? So we all use hypermedia in our daily life when we use a web browser. Yeah? When I explained a web browser to my mom, I just said, well, you open a bookmark or so I sent you, then you see a page, and on the page you see bluish or underlined pieces, and if you click on them, you are redirected to more interesting information about that. She understood very easily. She could use a web browser. And the same idea is with hypermedia and services. So here I give you a minimal JSON API example. So when people see JSON API the first time, they often say, oh, this is super verbose. Yeah, why not put, so this is basically a movie. The title is The Shawshank Redemption. It's ranked #1 at the Internet Movie Database, or at least it was when I created the slides. And people say, well, why don't you put title, year, and rating top level? Then you don't need the data ID type and stuff. And the reason is, in JSON API, each resource has both an ID and a type. And this tuple ID and the type is unique. And through this type system, it's easily possible that you say, if you have a huge compound JSON document that contains hundreds of resources, that a single resource with the same type and the same ID would appear only once in the document. And this is why director George Lucas would only append, even if you list the 1,000 best ranks of all the movies of the Internet Movie Database. Then there's the top-level structure, which is data. For the data part, it's obvious. Then we have meta for meta information, like created by, for example, last change, things that are meta information, not of the domain content of the resource, but more about the REST resource itself. And then we have the hypermedia part. We have links. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. In this case, we have a self-link. When you use hypermedia formats in REST, basically a self-link is very common in all formats. That is kind of the ID of the REST resource itself. You could say, yeah, there's at the very end you see a 1. So this is type is movies, so this is the movie with the ID 1. This is true, but it gives you much more value, also having the protocol HTTPS, the domain, the path, some query parameters, what have you. So if you send an email with this link, so I made up mymovies.com, it doesn't exist. But if it would, you could just click on the resource and you would get access to it. So now what is Spring HATEOAS? Spring HATEOAS is a Spring project that tries to abstract from the different formats, from XML, from JSON. In JSON, you have different formats like hell forms, and so on. And the programming model in Spring HATEOAS is always the same. So as a developer, you don't think what the structure of the JSON looks like. You only think about the domain, about domain attributes, about hypermedia like links or affordances or other things. And built in, there's a couple of formats. And since, I think, 3 years is it now, Spring HATEOAS also provides an API and framework functions that you could implement your own media type or existing media types that have no implementations in the core of Spring HATEOAS. And so some of the community members created one. And since at those days, I think it would be a good way to try out a real implementation of JSON API, I started this little open source project. So the key thing of Spring HATEOAS are links. You all know links from the web, and here in programming it's basically the same. So you can create a link in Java, and I mean you don't have to be experienced Java programmer. This is very much the same in each programming language. So you create a new link object, And if you don't do anything, it's a self-link automatically, or you can give it a name, or in hypermedia, it's called a link relation as a second parameter. Then we are software developers here, so we know one of the hardest things we do is finding the right names for things, right? So finding the right names for a class, for a method, for things. And this is the same for links. Yeah? And for instance, when your task would be provide a system with pagination, a user management system with pagination, or so you would come up, oh, how would I name the link to the next page? Would I name it next page? Would I name it next? In German, would I name it nächste Seite? Or so. And to answer those questions, please take a look at the IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And there's many domains where you already find best practices and suggestions for names. So when you want to find names for your links, look there. If you don't find it, come up with something yourself. So links are great for two things. Of course, like on a web page to navigate, but there's an even better usage. Just imagine you want to implement a shopping cart application, like we all know from Amazon or commercial websites, we can buy something. And imagine you would be a UI developer and you have this little shopping cart icon, and now your task would be, when is it enabled? When is it disabled? Yeah? As a UI developer, you say, oh, now I have to understand the whole domain process knowledge. So is the user logged in? Does the user have a valid address? Does the user have a valid credit card? And so on, and so on, and so on. And the UI would have to check everything of this and then enable or disable the icon. If the backend is enabled with hypermedia, there could be a contract like this. The backend says, dear front end, you asked me something, and whenever the user is able to pay, I just provide you a link called payment. Yeah, and you just search, is there a link called payment in the response? If yes, you enable the shopping basket icon. If someone clicks on it, you follow the link, and that's it. So with a little bit more of protocol knowledge, you save a lot of domain knowledge in many use cases. And this is one of the favorite usages of hypermedia in services. So back to Spring HATEOAS. So as I said, the internal model is not related to specific representation, but it's all about REST. Yeah? And REST, as you might know, is for representational state transfer. So we have representation models, yeah, and we manipulate resources through their representations. And super important, the domain model is usually not the representation model. For instance, if you have imagine you want to implement a printer, and I don't care if it's Python or Go or C# or Java, you would probably say, hey, you have kind of an object, printer, that has a method print. Yeah, and when someone wants to print, you create this object and then invoke object.print. In REST, you wouldn't do that because from the pure REST model, you would only use the HTTP verbs as verb, and print is not defined in HTTP. There's just post for creation, get for retrieving data, patch and put for changing data, and delete for deletion. What you would do instead is you would create a new noun. You might call it print job, and you all know this from Linux or from Unix. So you, instead of having a resource and then encoding something in the URL or also to print, you would do a post on a new print job resource, giving it some data in the body like the printer, and then later you could ask this print job, in which state are you still preparing, are you finished, and so on. And this is a RESTful way to implement that. Yeah. And back to Spring. Spring HATEOAS provides representation model abstractions. And here are the four. So representation model is a base for item resources like one movie. Then we have a collection model for a collection of movies. Yeah, if you just say get on a resource endpoint that is called movies, you will get a list of movies. And then entity model, this is a convenient class that says, well, I have a movie which is a pure domain model with no hypermedia and links at all. It just contains the name and the release year and what have you. And then with a simple construct, you can transfer this domain model into an entity model. And once you have an entity model, you could add links or affordances. And page model is a mix of both. So here's an example. So this is Java, but I think it's easy enough that everybody should understand. So this is a director. And in this simple example, it just have an ID and a string. Yeah? And we will see this later in the representation. Yeah? So when you use Spring HATEOAS out of the box, you get HAL, the hypertext application language. This is another media type by default. You don't have to do anything to do this. This is just built in. And this is the representation. You see it's different. It's underscore links, and the top level attributes are still top level, but this is what you get. Yeah? And when you use the library JSON API for Spring HATEOAS, you get a different thing, and I will talk about this now. So once we had this discussion internally in the API group, I just decided privately, so I also program and develop in my spare time just for fun, to play around with it. So I started this as an open source project using the Apache 2 license because this is the most common license in the Spring ecosystem. Yeah? And this is why it's not under GitHub Siemens, it's GitHub Total, my private handle. And so I started this, and it grew and grew and grew. I actually have a couple of contributors also from Siemens and from other companies, and then I decided later to keep it just this way. And for me, it's kind of relaxing. So right now at Siemens, I have different roles and jobs, and there's even weeks where I don't have time to do any programming. And then for relaxation, in the evening, I say, hey, there's something. I still can do some pushes, and this makes my day. So when you want to use it, by the way, it's fully OSS cleared within Siemens, so you can use it, this library, in any Siemens project. Also, you just specify it either in Maven or Gradle. Also, funny thing, I don't know if they do it on purpose, but every time I give a talk at a conference, there's a 89% likelihood that Spring releases a new version of Spring Boot or Spring HATEOAS just 1 week before. And I don't know if they knew that I'm here today, but a couple of days ago they released a new version, so it just takes me a couple of minutes. I did also a release just for this conference. So this is brand new using Spring Boot 3.5.0. So back to the example. So it's the same example that we had before. The point here is that from a developer point of view, you don't have to change anything in your internal model when you just want to use a different representation or a different media type. And then when you include the library just as a dependency, then you will see now that it's rendered at JSON API. Yeah, it's a little bit more verbose, but we have this tuple of ID and type, and then we have the attributes, and we put it here, then only the name of the director. The reason why there's a third thing, attributes, which is even more verbose, is in attributes, I could also use ID and type. So there's if I have a domain model that deals with types, no problem. If it's under attributes, I know this is my type. While it's under data, I know this is the JSON API type. So in the Spring ecosystem, everything is done by annotations right now. When it started with Spring, XML was very popular, so you could do XML thingies, but right now no one uses it. So there's a lot of annotations, and I don't want to go into details right here. So basically everything you can use in JSON API, you can use specific annotations. If you say, hey, the class name is movies, but I want to have the JSON API type Filme because I'm in a German domain, you could easily do this using annotation. Or if you have an attribute in your domain model created by, that indicates the author not of the movie, of the REST resource that represents the movie, then you can annotate it with JSON API meta. Here's a little example for that. So it's just a simple Java class with a few annotations. And if you do that, basically this would be the rendered result. So this is just the very basics. So this is if you say, well, you want to render several structures or media types, and JSON API is one of them, but you don't want to use specific JSON API features. But JSON API has a ton of useful features, and of course then the library provides API to use the special features. For this I created a builder. Most of you might know the builder pattern that you say you start with a simple object and then you have a dot annotation where you can say dot model this, dot relationship that, dot the other thing. At the end you say build, and then you get the object constructed. And one thing that is special to JSON API are so-called relationships. So for instance, in our example, we have movies and directors, and we can implement it in a programming language that we can say how we put relations in the data model, that we say, hey, a director has pointers to a list of his movies or her movies, and a movie has pointers back to the director. But if you don't want, you can make them totally separate entities and do the binding later. And this you can do easily with a relationship that you can say, well, when I have a movie, I can create a relationship to a director or many directors, and also the other way around. And this is specified in JSON API, which is nice because when people say, hey, JSON API is used and it's about movies and directors, they wouldn't have to read the manual to know how to add a director to a movie or how to delete a movie from a director. This is all specified how this works in JSON API. Of course, here we have the builder. And in this example, movie and director from the domain model are totally independent of each other. You can have a list of movies, a list of unrelated directors, and then when you create the REST API, then you say, hey, I have the movie Star Wars, and I put a relationship to the director George Lucas in it. And when it's rendered, then basically it's a new field called relationships. And then you would say, okay, we have a movie here called Star Wars. The type is movies, the ID is 1. And then we have relationships to a director. And then you might think, oh, this is weird, but I don't know the name of the director of Star Wars from this result. This is probably you don't want it. You just want to have the ID. You could implement a link, or this is basically done automatically, or you could include the director itself, George Lucas here, also in the result. I'll show you that later. This is called inclusion. So, and this is a good thing because you now have a very fine-grained access which data of which resources you want to include in a response. And the good thing here is what I mentioned. We can make sure that basically a REST resource with the same ID and type only occurs once in a huge compound resource. And here, for instance, many of you have seen the matrix And one of the directors is Lana Wachowski. And in the API, you can just say, hey, I get the result of all the movies, basically, and I want to include in the result also the directors of one particular movie. Yeah. And here's another feature that we like pretty much about JSON APIs called sparse field sets. And this means often you have REST resources that have quite a lot of attributes. For instance, at Siemens, we often have device APIs, and a device might have 50 attributes or so. But in most cases, you don't want to have those 50 attributes. You only want to have 3 or 5 or so. Yeah? People then came to us and say, this is a super use case for GraphQL. So we build up a GraphQL API, then we can do that easily. And others say, well, you know, if we have this specified in JSON API, then we could use it out of the box, basically. We already have a REST API. This simple use case, of course, GraphQL can do way more. But for the simple use case that you just want to filter for existing fields or so, this feature is built in JSON API. Yeah. And also from the programming perspective, it's super easy if you use the library to implement that. And with the library, there's a set of examples that showcase all the functionality. Unfortunately, I cannot do the demo because we couldn't get my notebook running here with the projector. So sorry, if you would be interested in a demo, I have my notebook here. I can show it live to you later today or tomorrow if you would be interested. So Meta I talked about. So there's an annotation for Meta, and for us, this was kind of convenient because when you don't read the docs and you just get a JSON result, it's often very hard to figure out from a client perspective which of the data belong to the actual domain object and which part of the data actually is meta about the REST resource itself, like created by, created at, or things like that. And JSON API gives you this. And a good example, for instance, is the pagination. So whenever you use pagination with JSON API, you get basically a collection of item resources. It's hidden on the top. Then you get a list of links, like the self link to the first page, to the previous page, to the next page, to the last page. And then you get meta information like what is the current page number, the page size, the total pages, the total elements, and so on. And this is just an example where meta really makes sense. Configuration, we skip. This is, of course, you can configure anything that is programmable in the library. But another thing that's interesting, and we liked quite a lot about JSON API, was the error handling. So, of course, we took a look at common error formats like problem plus JSON and things like that. But we figured out that we have to come up with so many things our own that we're missing from our existing use cases. And actually, with the JSON API error system, it worked out of the box, and we didn't have to add anything. We could just use it as it was. And another thing that is not so common, but JSON API provides it, is that you can have several errors in one response. Yeah? Imagine you invoke a REST API with query parameters. Yeah? You say, hey, I invoke this color API or this movie API, and the title should start with star, and the director should start with George, and this and this and this. And you have a typo in some of the query parameters. So usually you would say, hey, there's a typo in the name. Yeah? You would get an error. Then you correct it. Then you do the same query again. Then it would say, oh, but it's not director, it's director. Yeah, and you do it quite often, and every time you get a single error. And with JSON API, you could say, hey, I analyzed your whole queries, and there's actually three errors. You misspelled director, you misspelled name, you did this differently, and so on. And that reduces the number of tries pretty much. So we like that. And also a nice story. When we started with the Siemens guidelines, we started with JSON API, but it turned out that JSON API is a little bit too strict. Yeah? It's either JSON API or it's not. You cannot say it's 70% JSON API. Yeah? And many of our existing products said, oh, okay, I like those 5 features, but I cannot do the 6th one. It's just impossible. I won't do that. And this was the main reason that we softened JSON API a little bit and made it a little bit simpler to use and not so strict. For the current guidelines, they are still 100% backward compatible. So when you are at Siemens and you use JSON API, I assure you, you are totally compliant with the current guidelines. Yeah. But my point here is, so for the new thing, we started with problem plus JSON, and then I went on vacation, and when I came back, the team decided that JSON API error handling is so much better, we just take it over as it is. And so in the current API guidelines, we have a one-to-one copy of the JSON API error handling. Here's an example. So it's always an array, so you could return multiple errors. If there's just one, you have just a single element in this array. Errors can have links to something, explanation, a status, a title, a detail, and many other things. So conclusion is, if you want to use JSON API as a media type, and you happen to implement things with Java and Spring, then please take a look at the library. Maybe it's useful for you, and if you know other teams, just point them to the library. It's pretty well received right now, so we use it inside of Siemens, and there's many usages outside of Siemens, but it's still a niche project, so not so many people are using JSON API or even other media types that provide hypermedia. So we have time for some discussions, but before we start that, I would like to share some insights that I gained from developing this over the last 3 years. So firstly, when I started doing private open source projects, I was a little bit afraid that people who are much better developers than I come and say, hey, Kai, you don't, we would make it better, so do it this. Yeah? And this happens, of course, but 100% of the people who filed issues or errors were super nice. Yeah? They said, hey, great, I have I have something to improve. What do you think about this? Yeah? And once you get feedback like this, the fear that people just hit you with something goes real down. And so I do open source contributions for many, many years to bigger projects, and I really love that the community is really welcoming and really nice, and I also made the experience with that. Yeah. The second thing is, another thing which I figured out for myself is, since I know it's open source, everybody can use it, I really got super valuable feedback. So the community found bugs that I never thought they were possible, but they were. And the great guys in the community just filed an issue. They did a pull request saying, hey, Kai, here's the use case. I would expect this. It did not do that. I provided you a fix. Can you take a look at it? And then we did a little triage or discussion, and then it was fixed, and this made the whole thing really better. And this is also an experience where I think open source really helps. The guys of you who contribute to open source projects, even filing issues or so, will also hopefully have made the same experience. And then the last thing is, since I know it's public and people are really using it and taking a look at it, that motivates me pretty much to do this carefully. Yeah? So whenever I create a new feature, I make sure that I have a 100% or let's say 97% test coverage for it. And I try to adopt best practices so that you know that everybody can see it, motivates me to improve on things and trying the best rather than, you know, when my wife asked me to tidy up the kitchen, I'm not so motivated doing that. And I can encourage you when you do things even either within Siemens or privately or so, just try it out, and hopefully you will get a lot of very positive experience doing that. Okay, so those were a little bit of retrospective what I've learned with this project in the last years, and I think now we would have time for some questions. Thank you.
Hi Kai, thanks a lot for the great presentation. I think you made a pretty good point on the difference between the representational view on things and the domain model.
Yes.
And so I can imagine that JSON API is great if I have whatever, a single page application. For example, I have an IMDb browser or something like that. But does it also work the other way around? So like if I want to create, update or delete things, or do I then stick back to the domain model?
Yeah, so I tried to rephrase the question. So the question was, if we have a REST model, do we use it for everything, including update, delete, creating? And the answer is yes. So when you do a post, and then when you do a post, basically in HTTP, you specify the header content type. And in this case, you would specify application/vnd.api plus JSON. And then you say, yeah, the content type is also JSON API. Of course, you could implement a server that says, yeah, I would also accept plain JSON. Yeah, and then when you do the same post and say content type applications/JSON, then you post JSON, and then it depends on the intelligence of the server that the server might guess from the content which JSON API type you want to use. Yeah? For instance, when you post to a movies endpoint, the server could be smart enough to say, hey, whenever someone posts to movies, and a REST resource of type movies is created. Yeah. But there's, yeah, you could do, what I would recommend when you use JSON API as your main representation, do everything with JSON API out of the box, and even provide JSON API if you don't specify dedicated the content type.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions or remarks?
So a question about like testing, or one of the benefits, as I see from HATEOAS, is that you don't have hard-coded links on the client side.
Yes.
So you follow the links and not have a path somewhere encoded, but you have to ensure that the client does that. Do you do some tests that actually there are no hard-coded links, or how you validate that?
So the question was basically, how would I test links, and how would I make sure that nothing is hard-coded in there, right? So for the applications that I write using these libraries, yes, I write tests that do some, for instance, do a post to something, and I assume then that the implementation, the backend creates, for instance, a self-link, or if I use paginations, that there are links like next and previous and last in it, and then I test it. But I mean, when you use the Spring HATEOAS library, it's pretty hard to create links that are not using the programming abstractions for doing that. So it's you could do that, yeah. You could create a JSON object that mimics the representation of a link. But usually, when you use Spring HATEOAS, you just create linked objects, and then when it's deserialized or serialized, when you do a post, pet, or push, this is done automatically. Good. Any more questions, remarks, suggestions? There's one.
Maybe a twist on that question. So this is another framework that provides the server side. But from my own experience, I know the hardest part is having a machine RESTful client that actually navigates this and follows this and learns on the fly the application that is implemented on the server side. Is there something in your project, or do you have experienced someone using this and really have a HATEOAS client that follows, for instance, the links and so on?
Yeah. So I also try to rephrase the question. The promise of HATEOAS is that you could write clients that don't have much domain knowledge and just recognize from a response, for instance, what is a link and what you could do with it. Yeah. And in JSON API, there's no such thing out of the box which is called affordance, but there's other formats, like, for instance, health forms, where you could not only specify there's a link to the doctor, you could create an affordance that says, hey, you could create an appointment with a doctor, you have to do a post to this URL with this query parameters, and if you put it in the UI and want to have Swedish, the Swedish translation of the fields would be this. And then basically, for instance, you could use a generic client that doesn't know about the actual domain, but that automatically would create a user interface, which probably looks ugly, but at least you would have the methods, the URLs, and the fields you could do. Yeah. And another thing, we heard it in a previous talk, but one of my pet projects is I'm also the lead architect and developer of WeatherX, which is a weather service internally. Yeah. And what I recently did is writing an MCP server, of course, using Spring AI for that. Yeah. And with this MCP server, I figured out I can now do things with my weather service that I never thought that were possible. Yeah. For instance, just as an example, the weather service only supports latitude and longitude as location parameters. But now having an MCP server that understands the semantics of this, I could ask, what is the weather in Munich? Yeah, and then the LLM, for instance, could use for testing like Claude or something, or one of the many LLMs that the code team provides, or so, then understands that, knows the API, and then fills all the gaps that are to answer the question, even though the API doesn't provide the information out of the box. Yeah? And so when it comes to hypermedia, basically the LLM could then be smart, that it says, hey, I get a response that contains links and affordances, and I figure out what you as a client could do without it. Yeah? So instead of knowing with the doctor appointment thing, instead of knowing what is the URL for the appointment, what of the parameters, you could just type, make an appointment with Dr. Schmidt, or so. And then the MCP server would know the API, and the LLM would say, oh, I have an idea. So here is an API for an appointment. I need this parameter, and so on. And I think this is one of the use cases I'm pretty excited in the future, to combine APIs, like very I would say, static, even if you use dynamic links, but from the API specification, they are pretty much limited to static parameters or so. And when you embed it in a context of language models that can do much more, I think there's tons of new use cases to going exactly the direction you want to go.
Thanks a lot,
Okay.
Kai.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thank you.